So yeah, today I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, documentation, and how I love what Rustdoc and docs.rs allows us to do. Quick introduction. So I'm Francois Mockers. I'm very French and I have a strong French accent. Sorry for that. I tend to speak a little fast. I am the QA lead at Paylead. It's a French startup where we're doing bank transaction processing at scale, thanks to Rust. I'm also one of the maintainers of Bevy, where we take our documentation very seriously, at least we try to. And as I often do game jams, I'm a developer of random things, and I'm often looking at various crates. And sometimes, just from the doc, it's a bit hard to understand how to use it. So, documenting your code. First question is why you should do it. It enhances the discoverability of your crate, because users will be able to know if the crate matches their need and if they can use it. It will improve usability, because people will know how to use your crate and it will be better learning curves. And for you also, it will improve maintainability, because future you will be very happy to know what that function was supposed to do. So, documenting a function. The first thing to put in the documentation is what is it doing? It can be interesting just to rephrase it with different words, because the right word can click with the right person, and it's not always easy for everyone, as not everyone is a native English speaker. You should explain the parameters and the return value. If there are error cases and panics, document them. If the function is unsafe, explain the condition that has to be checked before calling it, and an example usage is always nice. For a struct, again, describing the struct, describing each field, the purpose, specify the default value if there's a default implementation, any constraint or invariance. For example, if a field is supposed to be an angle and should be between 0 and 2 pi, mention it because it's not encoded in the type system. If there are threads that the struct implement and that are interesting, mention them. Same for a related struct, and always an example usage. For a trait, then explaining the purpose and how you want to use the trait, the behavior it adds to structs that implement that trait. If there are associated types, document them. Relationship with other trait too. If you have default method implementation, explain how they will use the method that the user will have to implement so that they can work. And same, if you have blanket implementation of the trait, mention them. And always an example implementation. So we noticed three things that are recurring for documentation: explaining what it's doing and rephrasing it, documenting all the constraints that are not encoded in the type system, and an example. The last place where we put documentation is on modules or crates. There, it's more about organization of the code and where to find the different functionalities. It's always nice to highlight key features and give an example of common usage pattern, not of a specific usage of a function or a struct. The first tool we're going to look at is Rustdoc. I hope everyone knows it here. You can call it either with Rustdoc and give it a specific file, or with cargo-doc, and it will work on your whole project. It lives in the Rust repository, and it has its own book on how to use it and how to contribute to it. Here is the team behind Rustdoc, so thank you guys, you're doing a great job. And the tool, so it builds a website with your crate documentation. The website will have the signature of all the public elements of your crate. It can also include the private element if you pass the right flag. It will be organized by modules, and it's easy to search, and everything is linked together. This is very important for documentation, as we will see later. The next one is docs.rs. Again, I hope everyone here knows it. The website is in the name, and it lives in its own repo in the Rustlang organization. The docs.rs team, thank you guys too. It's great what you're doing. So the website, it builds the documentation of every crate published on crates.io, and it keeps the documentation of every published version. That is a lot of documentation to store. It uses nightly Rust, and it has an about page that not many people know about. When you're on the index page, you can find the link on the top right corner, and it has very interesting information about docs.rs. So let's look at some advanced features. We'll start with the basics. Everyone knows the syntax. So either 3/ for documenting an item, or 2/ and an exclamation mark for documenting a container. the latest, the /n is mostly used for documenting the root lib.rs or for documenting modules. It's also possible to put code examples in your documentation. Very importantly, they will be run as doc tests, so your code example will be always right and always checked. If you have setup lines that are not interesting for the documentation and for what you're trying to show, you can hide them by starting them with an hash sign. And it's possible to have a few attributes. So ignore means Rustdoc will ignore completely the doc example. It will not try to run it, to compile it. And the next three describe what will happen when it runs. Should panic mean a panic is expected, and you can even specify which panic it will be. No run means Rustdoc won't try to run the code example, and compile fail, the code example doesn't compile, and it will give an error. It can be interesting to describe a case where something doesn't compile in documentation. The next feature is the one I personally prefer. It's linking to items by name, also called intra-doc links. The idea is that you can put a markdown link to any item in scope of the Rust program. So for example, here I'm just using receiver, and as I imported it, the link will just work to it, and I will be able to access the documentation page. For future, it's not in scope, but I can just give the Rust path, and it will work. And the last case I wanted to mention, when linking to the receive function, I can use self because I'm in the same struct, so it will be able to find it and link it. This is very interesting for documentation and to be able to browse related things. Another interesting feature, this time you will have to use nightly Rust, is scrapping examples. As I said, having examples for all your documentation is very interesting, and it can be a bit of a pain when you also have complete examples living in the examples directory. That's where cargo-doc helps you, and it's able to find example usage of your functions in the example and link them directly in the documentation. So you don't have to do everything by hand. And next is the syntax we saw at the start with 3/. It's actually replaced by Rust when compiling with this attribute doc, and the two syntax shown on the screen are completely equivalent. So you can either use a comment or call the macro, and it will work. The macro takes as a parameter anything that is a string literal. It also allows us to add some configuration for our documentation. So, for example, we can have branding, like saying where our icon should be for the documentation, or a favicon, but also to have some configuration. For example, we can give specific warnings to ignore or check when compiling the test, or specify the root HTML if we want to deploy on something else than doc.rs. It's also possible to add configuration on items. So, for example, here I'm going to hide the public items. Even if it's public, it won't show in documentation because it's hidden. Another one interesting is inline and no inline. That will control if Rustdoc will create an individual page for an item or put it into its parent. So what the fact that it's an attribute that takes literal strings mean we can also call a macro, for example, the include as tr macro, that will read the linked markdown file and directly use it as a documentation. Code blocks in the markdown file will be tested, so it's very nice to have markdown files always up to date with your code. The only downside I have is that if you can't really use intra-doc links in the markdown file, because they won't be rendered correctly when you try to view the file without the documentation. But it's not only include string macro, for example, there is a very one called document features that will automatically parse the cargo.toml file, extract the list of features you have and their comments, format it, and present as documentation. Features are currently something that is very, very not documented on Rust crate. They have a name that is sometimes understandable, not always, but and it's not really possible to extend the cargo.toml format to add a mandatory documentation for them, because it would break every cargo.toml file existing. So what this crate is doing, it has a syntax for specifying comment for the toml file. So it's very similar to what we are used to. So hash sign and an exclamation mark will be a general comment, or two hash sign will be for the comment on the feature just under it. And from that, it will generate some nice HTML that you can put on your website. You can also have aliases for your documentation item. This is helpful because, as I was saying earlier, you often need to rephrase your documentation to click with the right person. So with alias, people will be able to search using the alias terms and find the correct function. And Rustdoc allows you to have conditional compilation. This is a configuration called doc. It's enabled when building with Rustdoc and only for that. So you can build part of your code only for Rustdoc if you have some weird dependencies. And it also allows you to build the items that should not be available. For example, if you're building on Linux, the Windows-specific things with this flag for Windows won't be compiled. But you can add the doc flag, the doc flag, and it will be also compiled for doc and shown in the documentation. The next one is on features again, but this time on features on your code. It's often interesting to be able to show in the documentation that something is available only if a specific feature is enabled. This is so for Rustdoc, this is a nightly feature, so you have to enable it at start. And then you have to use the doc with the CFG attribute and specify the feature that you want to check, and it will show up nicely. It's going to be automatic at some point. There's an RFC to stabilize it. It's a doc auto CFG feature. And the sad thing is it forces you to use nightly unless you want to do it only on docs.rs site. And then there is this little dance with attribute to do. So you enable the doc CFG feature only when building for the docs.rs site, and then on your attributes, you again do this whole dance. I just keep it on hand because it's hard to remember the exact syntax always, but yeah, it's something very useful. And so, as I was saying, when building for docs.rs, you have this configuration that you can check to be able to build some part of your code only on docs.rs and not on other case. This can be useful to enable only nightly features that are used in the docs, for example. There's another option to configure. It's in your cargo.toml file. You can specify this key, and then you will be able to specify which features or no default features the documentation build will use, and also the targets. If you're building a crate for some very specific target and don't want to build on Linux, this is the place to specify it. You can also pass arguments to cargo, to Rustc, and to Rustdoc, and we will see one very soon. But first, how about some HTML in your documentation? Because after all, it's a website. You can use more than just Markdown. You can put directly HTML. In this case, we're trying to document a color, and documenting a color with words is a bit hard, so we just put the HTML code to display it, and it's very nice in the documentation. Rustdoc also gives you a few CSS class. For example, here it's a warning callout, and it will display nicely in your documentation. And the last thing is actually you can pretty much do everything you want because you can extend everything. There is a flag to extend the CSS to add your own CSS. And there are 3 flags for HTML. The first one in header will let you add JavaScript to your code, to your documentation. Before content, we'll add an header, and after content, we'll add a footer. If you set it in your cargo.toml file, you can pass it automatically when it's built on docs.rs, and it will just work. Something important to keep in mind: be nice, because it's very possible to break completely the documentation if you do weird things. So an example of that feature is Mermaid. Mermaid is a way to describe graph in text form and to render them as graph. So there is a crate called aquamarine. When you add it to your crate and you configure it to run only when building for docs, then it will include the JavaScript to replace the graph. And when it's displayed on the website, the graph will be replaced by the actual graph, and it enables you to do much more rich documentation. Another crate that does something similar is katex for math typesetting, but it's for a much more specific domain. But yeah, you can have nice math formula in your documentation if you need to. Something about documentation I didn't talk about, but I still wanted to mention, the Rustdoc JSON output. It's very powerful, it's very rich. It's a JSON of everything Rustdoc knows about your code. You can use it for multi-step build. For example, first step, you build the JSON format. Then from that, you have a script that will extract all information about a trait, put it in a Markdown file, and then you build your documentation with that Markdown file included. Or use your imagination. There are a lot of things possible. There is a talk just after this one in the side track about using the Rustdoc JSON output to generate C++ API. It's very powerful if you want to do strange things. Contributing to Rustdoc and docs.rs, there's always work to do. It's very interesting. You can contribute to it without having to be in deep compiler knowledge, and it's still useful for everyone in Rust. If you do HTML, JavaScript, anything like that, it's possible to help. They have their own documentation on how to contribute. The source links everywhere in the documentation. You have a source link that will direct you to the source. I have trouble considering that as documentation, as it's a nice fallback, but it's just that when documentation is not enough. As a bonus, there is a flag for Rustdoc that if you enable it, every struct, every item in the source will also be a link to its own definition. And lastly, who are you writing your documentation for? Is it for users or for contributors? Personally, I think it's more for users, but sometimes having some side note for contributors can be useful. They can also be just comments in the code, and they would show up anyway in the documentation when people click on the source link. So some useful tips when using Rust, the documentation generated that I didn't saw a lot of people know about. You can search by signature when searching for an item. So for example, the first one, it will return me every item in the documentation that takes a new size and parameter and return a vec. So for example, vec with capacity. It's very, very powerful. You can find a lot of functions like that. For example, if you need to find every function that will return a given struct, you can search it like that. What's interesting for us when writing documentation is we can link to this, and it will be useful for documentation. Again, for example, for the case where we want to say, if you want to create a struct, just look at this function and give a link to the search. When your crate starts to be complicated, the documentation page can get quite long with all the traits, with all the implementation. But there's one section that I find very interesting for traits that you have to scroll down to find. It's the implementors section. It will list every struct in the context that implements your trait. For example, in this case, it's a part of the Bevy documentation. So we are looking for the trait system param, which is everything that we can inject in a system, and it gives us the complete list of what's possible to use. Again, it's very interesting to put it direct link in your documentation so that people don't have to scroll it if they don't know it exists. You can check your documentation coverage with Rust Nightly again. It will give you a nice ASCII table of everything that is documented, everything that is not yet documented, and if you have example for it or not. For example, here it's a case for BV ECS, and we're getting there with documentation. 100% is nice, but example is not yet there. Yeah. So let's take a step back and talk about documenting documentation. What is documentation? Of course, Rust being Rust, we have guidelines. They are interesting. There is a Rustdoc book on how to write documentation that is describing most of the features I talked about. There are the Rust API guidelines on documentation that are the rules one must follow when documenting Rust itself, but they are interesting to read, and if you apply them, it's already good. And Rust by examples also has a few examples for documentation. But I wanted to talk to you about a framework called Diátaxis, which is a way to split your documentation and the kind of documentation you're doing. It's using two axes. The first one is whether you are trying to learn something or trying to use it, so acquisition versus application. And the other one is whether you are trying to actively learn it or to just read more about it, so action versus cognition. Tutorials being action and acquisition, how-to-guide being action and application, and so on. So the website, it's a French domain, but don't worry, it's in English. But yeah, as French people, we like documentation. What it will help you is first find where you have holes in your documentation. So if all your documentation falls in one corner, then you have holes. It's up to you whether you want to fill them or not. But if you want to fill them, it will help you understand the content and what to write, the style you should have, so how to write it, and architecture, how to organize it. And there is another project that is very interesting. It's the Good Docs project. There are free templates for documentation. So you can have documents that will start you for everything that you want to document. It's very helpful to avoid the blank page syndrome. So where what we saw fit in this framework? The Rustdoc docs, obviously for me at least, they are in the reference corner. It's where people are using your crate and they want a quick link to how to use a function. So it's very important for them to be able to quickly find a specific information, which is why it's very important on the docs.rs site to be able to search, to have related links, and for precision where you're documenting something. Another part of your crate documentations are examples. They are in the how-to-guides corner. They should focus on presenting one use case to solve to solve it, and they can be bridged from the documentation with a scrapped example. I have an example of documentation that is a bit complicated and hard to read. It's in Bevy again. We have a lot of functions for easings, and here the documentation is the very specific mathematical functions used to do it. But there is an example that I find a lot easier to understand what's happening. It's just exactly the same math function, but drawn instead of described. For me, that's a lot more helpful to decide what I want to do. And finally, the two corners we are missing, explanation and tutorial. They are a bit harder to cover just with Rustdoc, but they can be somewhat covered with included markdown files that we can reference when building docs and without, but we have to pay attention to extra link. And sometimes it's easier for long-form text to put in a markdown file than just in a doc comments. And also the Clap crate is doing something very interesting. They have modules that exist just to document stuff. So they have a modules tutorial, a module FAQ, and they have many like that will describe every usage possible of the crate. It's very interesting how they did that. Two kind of last tools that I want to talk about. So MDbook, it's a very powerful book builder from Markdown file. It's made by the Rust community, so Rust code examples are tested, and it's very natural to progress to MDbook from Rustdoc, and it's very, very widely used in the Rust ecosystem. It's what's used for every book in the Rust repository, for example. And the last kind of tool is static site generators. There are two mainly used in Rust, they are Cobalt and Zola. The idea is to have a free-form website generators from Markdown file. I think you don't see the slides anymore. Okay. But one thing to pay attention is that there are no code validation at all on the code samples you put in your website. Except, with a little work, we can do it. For example, for Bevy, we put all the code samples in a Rust project that we check for and compile. And then in the website, we extract all code samples from the Rust project, so we know they are always valid. So in conclusion, write good documentation. It's very important, very interesting. And the QR code is to the slide that I just showed you, in case you want to have them for reference. Thank you.